All right, so moving on from plant reaction to stimuli, so how plants respond to external and internal changes in their environment, we're going to look at animals. And when we look at animal responses, we call these animal behaviors, how animals, a pattern of responses that animals have to stimuli in their environment are called behaviors. They can be conscious, they can be unconscious. Um, but given the increased kind of complexity of most animals to most plants, um, these processes will be a little bit more nuanced, but I in effect achieve kind of the same goals. So everything an animal does, or how it does it, or how it responds to a stimuli, is considered a behavior. Now we need to be really specific about grouping these into two types of behaviors: innate behaviors, or that are also called like instinctive, that are automatic, they're consistent, they're inherited. Um, Sometimes we think of these as subconscious, right? They do that no matter what. You kind of already know, they don't have to practice. These behaviors are passed down, and we see a lot of these in wild animals. Um, Migration patterns, reactions to uh, certain threatening stimuli are innate, and then there are learned behaviors. So these are behaviors that develop in response to stimuli that are in a particular organism's environment during its lifetime, and that develop over that lifetime. And it's important to distinguish between innate and that they're flexible. They're variable, so they change or can be changed with experience and with environment, whereas innate behaviors cannot really be changed all that much. So both of these types, learned and innate, are very important in understanding how different animals respond to their stimuli. But why would we study how animals behave? Well, behavior is part of an evolutionary perspective. It's part of the phenotype, and it can be acted on by natural selection. So think about different behaviors as different traits, and they can become beneficial or detrimental in different situations based on what is selected for and what allows an organism to survive better in a given environment. And most behaviors can be tracked back to some sort of evolutionary advantage, at least behaviors that we see in contemporary organisms. So when we're studying a behavior, there's a number of things that we can ask or we can look into concerning a specific behavior, such as what is the proximate cause, or what's the antecedent to the behavior? What's the stimulus or what's the mechanism? Okay, so for example, in a songbird, we might say, what causes it or triggers it to sing? How does it sing? And why does it sing in that way? So those questions have to deal with the proximate cause, the immediate stimulus or mechanism. We can look at that same question, how and what, at a deeper level to discover the ultimate cause. So what is the significance? This is the why question. How does that specific behavior contribute to the survival and reproduction of that organism, or what's the adaptive value? So maybe why does that male songbird sing at all? Why do songbirds sing? That has to do is that's getting at uncovering the ultimate cause. So, like we had talked about, there is an evolutionary need or an evolutionary motivator behind all behaviors. And looking at them, those motivations broadly for the kind of the two class groups of behaviors, um, innate behaviors are automatic and fixed, so they don't have to be learned. And despite any different environments, all the individuals exhibit that behavior. So these innate behaviors have or the development, the evolution of innate behaviors are very important because they are key for the early survival of a species or an organism before, especially in time periods of its lifetime, before it has the ability to really leverage built and learned behaviors. So things happening innately, right? Especially things, or especially, I shouldn't say things, that's kind of ambiguous, especially behaviors that are key to the basic survival of an organism, avoiding danger, knowing where to migrate to, things like that, have a real evolutionary advantage because there's no need to have a learning curve. It's automatic. Learned behaviors are just as critically important because it makes an individual able to better adapt to its specific context and environment by allowing for variability and flexibility to modify innate behaviors based on how that organism is interpreting actions in its environment. So, first among innate behaviors, we have what's called fixed action patterns, and these are sequences of behaviors that are basically unchangeable and usually happen completely. So, uh, we might use this example with a male stickleback fish, and you can kind of see it's got a red underbelly. And female stickleback fish are usually grayish green and have a silver underbelly. So, for the male stickleback fish, perceiving another red underbelly is what we call a fixed action pattern. It's a release or a trigger. Uh, sorry, wait a minute. So a male fish seeing a red underbelly is what's called a sign stimulus. It's what triggers a fixed action pattern or a sequence of behaviors, aggression, towards that imposter. So it doesn't matter, as we see over here, what shape that object is. It's that sign stimulus of the red underbelly that triggers it. We could have the most realistic model, but just being gray, and it wouldn't elicit the fixed action pattern. So here's just some other examples of fixed action patterns. Now, along with a fixed action pattern, we have what's called a supernormal stimulus. A supernormal stimulus is kind of when um, an organism is responding more to a larger sign stimulus. So, for example, um, in in this uh, in this seagull, it responds to um, this kind of this red piece on the bill of an act of um, what do we call it? A bird by pecking. And when it's absent, no pecking. When it's present, pecking. Okay, so that would be like a sign stimulus fixed action pattern. But when we engineer a larger sign stimulus, even artificially, we get a increased fixed action pattern compared to even the normal stimulus. And there is a large debate about whether this is an adaptation or it's just an artifact of doing the experiment. Um, some innate behaviors consist of like directed movement, so taxis, changing direction in response to different things in your environment. So this might be moving forward or away from different stimuli like light phototaxis or chemotaxis, or even kinesis to change in the rate of movement in response to a stimulus. So with this pill bug, um, changing the rate of your movement based on the moisture that's present. Just because innate behaviors are don't need to be learned doesn't mean they can't be complex. So migration is a complex innate behavior where birds and other flying creatures like that seem to use many different tools like the sun, the stars, the Earth's magnetic field innately to find their way great distances. And then we get to kind of the area that is a mixture between the two, which is like imprinting, which is kind of a mixture between innate and learned behaviors. So, learning to form social attachments at specific points in a lifetime called a critical period have both innate and learned components. So, most animals innately will begin to imprint on organisms that they might deem as their caretakers or their parents or something like that. But within that, the behaviors they then learn from the imprinting are learned behaviors. Okay, are then learned behaviors. So that's an example, a kind of innate and learned behaviors coinciding. One thing is especially about imprinting is very important to conservation biologists. So conservation biologists need to take advantage of imprinting on especially young organisms that they're trying to conserve in order to teach them important skills that they would have only learned from their parents in the wild. And that's actually one thing that's really dangerous and detrimental about, you know, taking in a wild animal as a pet is you kind of breaking them of that natural instinctive learning and imprinting cycle, which could make it eventually impossible for them to reintegrate into their environment. Talking about how imprinting happens during critical periods, all organisms have critical periods, which are kind of sensitive phases, especially early in their development, that are really optimal for imprinting. Um, And it really stands to reason that for many organisms, there are some behaviors that have to be learned during a specific receptive period, or else they can't really be learned at all. For example, um, for a lot of birds, their songs need to be learned during a certain critical period, or else they won't really be able to develop fully at all. One of the points of behavioral research in humans is whether humans have a critical period at all. Are there some things that can only really be learned during critical periods as humans without a great detriment to the ability to produce those behaviors later on? Within learned behaviors, there's a lot of different scaffolds for learning. So, for example, associative learning or learning to associate a stimulus with a specific consequence. So this produces that, or if I do this, this happens. And then more psychology-based kind of operant and classical conditioning. Um, we don't need to go into as great of detail with these as you might experience in AP psychology, um, but they're examples of how organisms acquire learned behaviors or mechanisms under which learned behaviors are acquired. Here's the classical Skinner's box looking at operant conditioning and Pavlov's dog with classical conditioning. Like I said, for AP biology, these are more to be familiar with. Um, and less to delve into extremely deeply as far as the psychology behind them. There's a period within learning called habituation where there's a loss of a response to a stimuli. So we get uh, used to a certain stimulus and we no longer elicit the desired response. It's kind of like cry wolf effect. So kind of overexposure to a specific stimulus may decrease the response. And habituation is really, a form of learning. So for example, um, if you ever had a little dog or something or a puppy, uh, they might be scared by everything, kind of when you take them outside for a while. But after a while, those same stimuli won't elicit such fearful responses as they become used to uh, those stimuli and no longer associate it with anything threatening. A lot of the big questions with learning, specifically the animals, is do animals reason or use critical thinking? Um, it's clear that other animals use tools. Crows use tools. Um, of course, other primates use tools, and our closest relatives in the chimpanzees elicit problem-solving strategies. But the how to what extent are these things planned and rationalized? Social behavior is a really important thing to study. So how animals interact in groups. There's a really big evolutionary advantage in developing cohesive social behavior in order to communicate um, and form agnostic behaviors, dominance hierarchies, and these sort of things. Language plays a real importance in social communication. So even bees communicate in performing what's called a waggle dance. So when bees come back to the hive, they their dance or their kind of figure that they trace out in the honeycomb, is used to communicate the distance from the distance from the hive to their food source and the angle of the sun uh, in relation to their food source, and that's communicated by the length of this waggle phase in the middle. The longer waggle phase means that the food is farther away, and the angle at which this dance happens communicates the angle of the food source relative to the sun, which is really complex if you think about it comparatively. This is where I wanted to stop for today, and we'll pick up from here next time.